Kolamausi Nidashinzi, I see that we have 83 relatives and allies that are here. Wichiwa New Kaniwik, Nino and GIE, Shana, Wisconsin, Lenape, Mohikanewe Kwe, Nino and GIE, Shana, Wisconsin, land of the Menominee Nation, the Wild Rice people. Welcome in. Super excited to have the Pacte Loew, as in Dr. Loew. She was on my dissertation committee. She is a retired awesome sauce from UW-Madison as faculty, and now is running the Center for Native American Indigenous Research. It's a Center for Native American Indigenous Research Center, which you'll hear about at Northwestern University. She works with a lot of our allies that are on here from Northwestern, so shout out. I want to welcome you into the first keynote of CREA 2021. We're very happy that you're here. Dr. Loew will be talking about ethics evaluation and 7th-generation thinking against the backdrop and the context of colonization. I'll give you her bio. Dr. Loew is the director for the Center for Native American Indigenous Research at Northwestern University. She is a professor in the Medill School of Journalism. Did I say Medill?
Medill? Mm-hmm.
Medill. She is Ojibwe Kwe, the Bad River Lake of Superior Ojibwe, Mashkishibi. Did I say that right?
Or Mashkazibi. That's
Mashkazibi.
We answer to that too.
Mashkazibi. She's Hole Awesome Kwe. She is a former broadcast journalist in public and commercial television. She is the author of many books, including Indian Nations of Wisconsin, Histories of Endurance and Renewal, Native People of Wisconsin, which is used by over 20,000 Wisconsin school children, and it's way more than that, as a social studies text. She also wrote Teacher's Guide to Native People of Wisconsin and 7th-Generation Earth Ethics. In 2019, she produced a story map and GPS-guided Indigenous tour of Northwestern. She's super active in land acknowledgement and helping others be their best, including myself. She is the reason that I am so stuck on sovereignty in the legal aspects, besides the cultural and traditional aspects of tribal and First Nations. She's done many documentaries and commercial TV, and including the award-winning Way of the Warrior, which was on PBS in 2007 and 2011. She works extensively with Native youth, teaching digital storytelling as a way to grow the next generation of Native storytellers and land stewards. In 2019, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, woohoo, and received the state of Wisconsin's Martin Luther King Jr. Heritage Award. I could literally go on and on for this warrior woman, and she's super humble and she's super fun. There are very few people that I know, her, Dr. Carolee Dodge Francis, that are actually traditional women embedded in community that also are faculty. So they are Alokian warriors, Alokian Kike. They are in service community warriors to our community members. So without further ado, Patty, we can't wait. Please, yes, put your comments in the chats. I'll watch them, and I'm zipping it now.
Would you write my obituary when the time comes? Man, that was awfully nice. Thank you.
You bet.
So let me introduce myself traditionally as well. Patty Loew, Waswakanokwe, Patty Loew, Indigenous, Mashkazibi, and Dojaba, Hmong, Dodum. I want to thank Drs. Stafford Hood, Timothy Leahy, Nikki Bowman for inviting me here, and thank you so much to all of you who invited me to be part of this evaluation conference. I'm really excited to be here. I'm very touched that you would think of me. I'm going to share my screen, and I think you should be seeing ethics evaluation and 7th-generation thinking. Right? Can somebody give me a shout out and tell me that that's what they're seeing?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. All right, so wanted to start with who I am, some of who I am. Waswakanokwe, Torchlight on the Water Woman. Some of you may have seen a fish over my shoulder before I went to my slides. Tim asked me, is that a rainbow trout you're looking, behind your behind your shoulder there, and it actually is. Waswakanokwe translates to torchlight on the water woman, but there's a deeper context. It's the torchlight that is used to spear fish. And that's something that is embedded in our culture. It's something that the French noticed when they encountered us a couple hundred years ago. And in fact, Lac de Flambeau, Lake of the Torches, is Waswaganing. And it's just a really important part of who the Ojibwe people are. Meshkazibi, you know us as the Bad River Band of Lake Superior. Ojibwe, Meshkazibi actually means medicine, and it refers to the Kakagan sloughs where we have 75 acres of wild rice. Nikki mentioned I'm a professor in the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and with a lot of other leadership, I direct the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, the sum of who I am. I'm also a mother to 2 boys, a wife to a very patient man, and a daughter to my 99-year-old mother, who is still alert and ambulatory in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a powwow dancer, a gardener, and I aspire to be a good relative. So the center where I work was founded in 2016, partly to redress the wrongs of our founder, John Evans, who may or may not have been a principal figure in the Sand Creek Massacre, depending on which investigation you read. We have identified 4 research hubs that we are trying to hit. One is global indigeneities, nationhood, law and governance, environments, health and social welfare, and communities, culture, and activism. When I was hired, I was asked, well, so what are your goals? And I think I took the dean aback a bit when I said, I have no idea, because I think, and this is maybe what's wrong and where we start to decolonize academia, we start with listening. And I said, I don't know what my goals are. I'll tell you in 2 years, after I've met with Indigenous students, faculty, and staff here at Northwestern, when I talked to the urban Indian community in Chicago, when I talked to the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, who are our nearest relatives, and to the Menominee and Oneida, who have a presence and organizations here in the Chicago area. So almost 5 years later, we're really excited about where we are. We started with 2 of us, and almost 5 years later, we have 42 affiliates working across 18 departments, 5 colleges, and 7 other units. We have faculty, graduate, and undergraduate fellows, 18 active and pending grant projects. And we developed a Native American and Indigenous study minor, which we run out of our center. When I mentioned the affiliates, the 5 colleges include engineering, humanities, the Medill School, the School of Education and Social Policy, our medical school, we have affiliates there. And we also have affiliates where you would expect to find them in the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, the library, the Block Museum, admissions, and we have an affiliate in the Newberry Library's Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies. The title included the phrase 7th generation philosophy, and some of you may be familiar with this concept, but it's this notion that decisions made today should be in the best interests of people 7 generations into the future. Now and there are quite a few tribes that actually have this this philosophy, and sometimes it's interpreted differently. For some, it means 7 generations into the future. For others, it means 3 generations into the future, 3 generations back, and the present generation. But the essence of it is about being selfless and thinking and be willing to sacrifice in order to make the world better for the people that come after you. And it also invites us to look back and understand that the benefits and the quality of life that we enjoy today are the result of decisions made in our best interests 7 generations earlier. My great-great-great-grandfather was one of the treaty signers of he signed 2 of the 3 cession treaties that basically transferred land from the Ojibwe to the federal government for what became Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. And for a long time, I was kind of ashamed to really talk about that because, I just, how could you do that? How could you give up this land? Well, as I matured, I understood that there was no question that the land was going to be surrendered. Just look from coast to coast, all land was surrendered. But one of the really interesting things, and this was an enlightened view into the future, visionary thinking, he and the other treaty signers insisted that the land that they were being forced into giving up, we could hunt, fish, and gather rice upon the waters. That was the language. We reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather rice upon the waters of the land that we are giving up. And that was brilliant visionary thinking. So what does that mean for you as evaluators? Well, how do you know what's in the best interests of Native American communities? And my advice is you should look at research, outreach, and evaluation and determine whether it reflects Indigenous frameworks. Is it sovereignty affirming? Is it sustainable? Is it community framed? Is the language being strengthened? Are native languages included in the research or outreach project? And maybe there are some other things that I'm interested in finding out, and I'm not seeing people, so I can't get a good sense. I'd be really interested to learn how many of you have evaluated Native American or Indigenous research or outreach projects. And I don't know if there's a way we can, I'd be interested to know who's in the audience. One of the things I'm going to do here is hide my floating meat. Okay.
We can put stuff in the chat, and I think we can unmute people, but I will ask Tim.
Okay. I'd just be interested to know, and if there are things that you have seen in research and outreach that are not on this short list, I'd be interested to read them. So if you want to include that in the chat, that would be great. I wanted to share this with you. I work with some amazing people at CREA, and we have a preponderance of women in our center, and they're the roll up your sleeves and get to work kind of women. And one of my favorite quotes comes from our associate director for outreach and engagement. And I heard her mention this in a meeting with a lot of suits and powers that be at the university. They were talking about, what do the Native Americans need? And, how can we help them? And how can we help Native students succeed at this university? And she just kind of flipped it around on them and said, that's the wrong question to ask. Don't ask what Native students need in order to be successful at this university. Ask, what changes do we as a university community need to make in order to create an environment where Native students can be successful? And I think that's something that can broadly apply to all students, really. But she told them, we don't need projects that lift us up. We need projects that have our backs. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. So what does this mean for evaluators? Well, it means, when you're evaluating, look for things like saviorism and voluntourism and tropism and neocolonialism. And for those of you who aren't familiar with these terms, although I suspect that many of you are, saviorism, yeah, Native people may have been victimized by policies, but victimization is not the sum total of who we are, and we don't need saving. We know what we need. Just help us with the tools or get out of the way. Voluntourism. Kumbaya is nice, hands across the water, but there are some groups and projects where our so-called helpers get more out of the project than we do. So, make sure the programs you evaluate don't use Native people to assuage white guilt or make us feel like we're, exotic inhabitants of some, people zoo. Beware of stereotypes. Are the programs you evaluate defining us by our deficiencies, alcoholism, drug abuse? We need to lose those tropes. We're not all noble savages living close to the land or being one with the universe. And as far as neocolonialism, look for ways to indigenize and decolonize. Make sure that the programs that you evaluate are reflecting the community's protocols and not just imposing colonial structures onto these projects. I know that all the Indigenous people in the audience will recognize this graphic, the 4 R's of Indigenous research, outreach, and evaluation: respect, relationship, responsibility, and reciprocity. If a research, outreach, or evaluation adheres to the 4 R's, it will, by default, be successful. Respect is pretty much self-defining. We all know what respect is, but in this context, we're talking about respecting Indigenous knowledge, reflecting cultural humility. I hear a lot of people talk about cultural competence. I don't think it's possible for me to be culturally competent in Ojibwe culture. I mean, there's so much to know. We can't be competent in somebody else's culture. We can be humble and we can listen and we can we can acknowledge that we don't know a lot and ask people to be patient with us when we make mistakes. So I think humility is really the virtue that we're looking for. Respect means you adapt to cultural protocols of that community. If possible, incorporate Indigenous language. And I know I keep coming back to that, but there are estimates that 90% of the world's Indigenous languages will be dormant by the year 2040. You notice I didn't use the word extinct. Because now we have recording devices and we can preserve languages, but if they're not used, they don't become extinct, they just become dormant. And so a lot of Native communities, I mean, this is a serious anxiety, paranoia in Indian country throughout the United States. Everybody is trying to preserve and revitalize their languages and introduce younger generations to those languages in the hopes that those languages will be used fluently throughout the community. So and why is that important? Well, our culture, our worldviews, our ceremonies are embedded in our languages. So projects that celebrate and incorporate Indigenous knowledges are crucial in Indian country. So relationship, boy, that's the foundation of any good research or outreach project. And when we talk about relationships, we talk first about listening, but these are relationships that should be collaborative, non-exploitive, sustainable, long-term. You talk to any non-native researcher that's spent time with a community, they will tell you that when you commit to a research project, you are committing long-term, or you should be committing long-term, because, relationships are built on kinship, and sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with blood. It's all about kinship. And, if you build trust with a community, people aren't going to forget you. and they're not going to let you off the hook either, which is a good thing. Relationships should be ethical, and they should be relevant. It should be something the community wants. Responsibility. This is where it gets really dicey with academic communities, because there's all that concern about copyright and intellectual property. Well, Native communities own their knowledge. Indigenous data sovereignty is becoming a really big issue. It's on the front burner. Indigenous communities want the data that's been collected about them, the health records, the boarding school records, the photos, all the information that governments and churches and business and industry have collected over the past 500 years. We want that knowledge. It's about us. And, a lot of the knowledge is wrong. And so we want an opportunity to correct the misconceptions that are embedded in that data. Native communities want to shape the research that's done on them, and we would rather shape research done in collaboration with us rather than have research done on us. We want access and control of our data, and we want researchers to adhere. We know you have to adhere to your institutional review boards at your universities, but some tribes are developing their own tribal IRBs, and some have research protocols. Maybe it's the research gets taken to a council of elders or some other advisory group that is familiar with research and has the authority to act on behalf of the community. And, this can really be a problem. I've seen on more than one occasion where a researcher was working in a community and had the buy-in from the tribal government, but nothing was in writing. There was no MOU or anything like that. And this person spent 6 years conducting this research. And then there was a change in tribal government, and maybe because of politics or maybe other things had changed in the community, but the incoming tribal leadership said, we don't want that published. And that person was, a few months away from tenure and never got tenure. So this is something needs to be ironed out. You have to be aware of the research protocols in these communities. And then reciprocity. We're talking about exchange for mutual benefit. Full participation on the part of tribal community people, shared decision-making, attribution in academic publications if community people want that, and compensation when it's appropriate. Sometimes it's not, but often it is. Maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I had a graduate student who opted for the 3-journal form of her dissertation rather than writing a book. And the middle journal article was about water quality. And the grad student had sort of a quantitative approach to water quality, but collaborated with a tribal historic preservation officer who contributed the oral history and traditional ecological knowledge of, how a community and why a community needs to understand water quality. And that community member had her contributions clearly defined in terms, it wasn't just the grad student incorporating it and acknowledging that the community member had shared the information. It was the community member wrote in Times New Roman italics, and the graduate student wrote in Arial, bold. So you could see the different voices. And that dissertation, that journal article within the dissertation was co-published. And those are the kinds of that's the direction that collaborative research with Indigenous communities, that's where it's headed. So I wanted to talk about one research project and one outreach project. And again, should I stop here and see if there are any questions, Nikki? I can't see any of the participants, so I'm depending on you. Oh, Nikki, I think you are muted.
Sorry. I said, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if there are, you can put them there or raise your hand, and I think we can unmute you before we go into our case studies.
Okay, and I have eliminated my little floating control, so I don't see any of the chat or anything like that.
Yep, and I'm looking at, people are giving active land acknowledgement. They're using language, culture from, all over.
Cool. All right, well, stop me if there are any questions that need to be answered here. I'm going to just talk about this first case study. That was an NSF grant proposal. We were successful in the planning stage. We hope to be successful in the implementation phase, but it involves resilience. It's a collaboration between Northwestern University and Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, representing 11 Ojibwe tribes, signed the same treaties, protected the same off-reservation hunting, fishing, and gathering rights in present-day Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So it started by listening. We proposed, and it was interesting because we didn't propose specific research. And a lot of the Northwestern academics were really very nervous about that. And the Indigenous people from Northwestern who were part of the grant making said, well, okay, we have to, it's all about relationship building. We need to, find out what the community wants. And the other academics were like, oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. But what exactly would be the research that we proposed to NSF? Well, we don't know because we haven't talked to the community. Oh yeah, of course we have to, but exactly what would we be saying to NSF? So it was this interesting learning process. So we convinced them, let's propose workshops through which we will build relationships and we'll find out what the community wants. And so that's what we did. The workshop number one was we asked elders, and there are probably 40 people representing these 11 Ojibwe communities. Tell us about traditional ecological knowledge. What should we know about that in order to make sure that whatever research we collaboratively propose is research that that is relevant and important to you and meaningful. Define resilience. What does that look like? And along the way, we came to understand that they were very concerned about safeguarding Indigenous data, and they wanted Indigenous data sovereignty. And they wanted to collect not just scientific ecological data, but also traditional ecological data. And when that kind of knowledge is collected, there could be sacred knowledge. And they wanted some kind of firewall so that that knowledge wasn't shared with outsiders. And we all agreed that they absolutely had the right to be the arbiters of what was shared and what wasn't. And we looked at ways that we could create those firewalls. We wanted to use, well, they told us that they wanted to use an Indigenous research framework. And the next slide will show you what that looked like. Mind-blowing for me. And one of the things that we understood, GLFWC, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, these are native scientists with, with lots of degrees at the end of their names. But what's different about GLFWC is it asks a cultural question and then applies science to answer it, which is really interesting. Through the workshops, the second workshop, individual tribal communities within this 11-member GLFWC organization began describing, what keeps them up at night and what they were interested in focusing the research project on. And it was clear that wild rice and water quality were that was where they wanted the research to focus. Workshop 3, they said, okay, so we've told you what we're interested in, what do you guys got? Well, we have these little battery-less sensors that can pick up, battery nanosensors, interesting. Could you put them on, could you put them in fish or on fish and find out where the fish migrate? Yep, we can do that. Could you put them on a wild rice plant underwater and collect data as it pops up through the water and into above the surface? Yeah, we can do that. Could you put them on individual wild rice harvesters? Yeah, we can do that. So by the end of the third workshop, we were really on the same page, and as far as best practices, rules of engagement, creating governance documents, building in these Indigenous data sovereignty firewalls. And this is what we came up with. Well, I guess it's the next slide. Okay, what we learned, TEK is not like SEK, which tries to disprove theories and methodologies. TEK just is knowledge. It's a living way of life. And that was, it was described as indigenology. You guys, and we were told, you guys have all got these fancy degrees. Well, I've got a PhD in indigenology, which we really appreciated. It's knowledge that doesn't come out of a book. It's knowledge that's lived and learned. It's knowledge that comes from your elders. It's active knowledge. It's knowledge acquired through reciprocity. And so it was a wonderful learning opportunity for us. And this is what we came up with. One of the things that that our collaborators communicated to us was the Ojibwe worldview. It's an ascending pattern of dependence. So you have the physical world, the rocks, the water, the air, fire. The next order is the plant world. The plant world's dependent on the physical world, but the physical world isn't dependent on the plants. Then you have the animal world, dependent on both plants and the physical world, but the dependency doesn't go the other way. And then you have human beings, and we are the most dependent of all. We're dependent on animals, on plants, on the elements, but none of those orders are dependent on us. And so the Ojibwe partners were really interested in collecting data about, all 4 orders of creation and putting sensors in each of the orders and constructing it so that we were looking at seasonal activities that really define who the Ojibwe people are. Fishing in the summer and gathering. Harvesting rice in the fall, ice fishing, trapping in the winter, tapping maple trees and sugaring, spearfishing in the spring. And because scientists just love acronyms, we wound up calling it STRONG, which we kind of liked a lot. The other thing I want to talk about is our outreach project, and Nikki mentioned it in her introduction, an Indigenous tour of Northwestern. We created a story map. When I arrived at Northwestern and did my listening and said, so tell me about the campus Indigenous community. Tell me about, the urban Indian community. And the word that I kept hearing over and over and over again was invisible. We feel invisible. So the Night Lab, which is part of the Medill Journalism School, has something called, they developed an app called a story map. It's an interactive approach to storytelling that incorporates maps and text and images, graphics, audio, and video to provide place-based context to a project. So the purpose of this story map was to really address the invisibility of Native people on campus, to educate students, faculty, staff, and visitors to Northwestern, and contribute to Northwestern's diversity issues. So I teach a media history class, and well, before I talk about my class and how we organized it, I actually began with listening sessions with the Pekagan Potawatomi, went down to the American Indian Center, talked with people there, interviewed Native American students, staff, and faculty. And this was something because, as I mentioned, Northwestern has this fraught history with a founder who was governor of the Colorado Territory and directed Colonel Shivington to kill Indians, and Shivington did. And so Northwestern has some atoning to do. And so it was important to me to procure an internal grant rather than go outside for something that I really felt ethically Northwestern should underwrite and support. So yep, then I teach this media history class. So I have all these eager, smart, skillful journalists who have all this experience with all these really cool apps and video and audio, and so why not use the talent that we have on campus? I had done some initial research and found connections in 14 different locations on campus. We split the students up into teams, and each student researched 2 locations. They generated content within their interests, environmental reporting, sports, social justice, art and culture. And I really encouraged them to stay within their media wheelhouse. If they were visual artists, to stay within, shooting video. If they were really good at infographics, to do that. And we wanted to produce a GPS guided handheld video, a GPS handheld audio walking tour. I think I messed up the order of my adjectives there. All right, so it's an app that lives on your phone, and there are 14 echo points and in the walking tour. And when you get within 35 yards of a designated spot that has some history, you'll hear some music and then a recorded audio describing the spot. So Carlos Montezuma, for example, got his medical degree there. That was an opportunity to talk about the Society of American Indians and his background. There was a 1903 football game between the Carlisle Indians and Northwestern. Northwestern got it handed to it. I think it was like 26-0 or something. But good opportunity to talk about Indian boarding schools and about how just sports and race and ethnicity at the turn of the century. We had just finished our new Ryan basketball arena, and the floor, and I learned this, which was really interesting, some of the best basketball floors in the country, the ones that are used for the NBA finals and the March Madness venues, are made of white maple from the Menominee forest. And so this was an opportunity to talk about termination and the Menominee Nation and its amazing forest. There were one of our affiliates teaches a maple tapping class. We're tapping trees on the Northwestern campus. So that was another stop. So, you know, there were just all these different kinds of stops. Some of it was kind of sobering sort of history, but some of it was just celebratory. And we really tried to include Native people from the Chicago American Indian community. There was a man that had been to a boarding school, and so he was interviewed. We incorporated Native perspectives. Our students did interviews with Native people. We highlighted Native languages. One of my favorite moments, and this was such an exciting moment for me. Back in the 1980s, I was a broadcast reporter working for an ABC affiliate in Wisconsin, and I interviewed an elder from the Prairie Band of Potawatomi who lived in northern Wisconsin. And in the Potawatomi language, where he would talk in Potawatomi, but then he would instantly translate himself. He told the story that his uncle had told him about being removed from Chicago after the Treaty of Chicago in 1833. And so here's this amazing interview with this elder that I knew was significant at the time, and gave the raw tape to the Wisconsin Historical Society for preservation. At that time, there weren't any tribal museums or research facilities in Wisconsin, and it was the only place I could think of to protect this priceless knowledge. So when we were putting the tour together, I contacted the Historical Society, and they digitized the recording and sent it back to me, and it's incorporated into this tour. And so, you know, you can hear Potawatomi language being spoken, and this wonderful elder telling this this very traumatic story about, you know, how the Potawatomi were removed from Chicago. But there was one of the things that I asked the students. I said at every stop, I don't care how tragic the story that you're telling might be, find a way to pull it forward, make it contemporary, and include an empowering element. So yes, tell the story of boarding schools, but also interview somebody with the American Indian Education Association about what Indian education looks like when Native people are in charge of it. You know, talk about Wadokanading, Ojibwe language immersion school on the Lac du Flambeau, on the Lakota Reservation. And before anything went live, we shared what we had created with our Indigenous partners and invited them to comment on the segments and edited before they went live. And we shared, one of the things that was really exciting too was we shared our archival material. So for example, the Potawatomi language department, which had helped us with one of our stops, we offered them, with the permission of the Wisconsin Historical Society, this uncut interview with Nelson Shepo describing the Potawatomi removal. And this was, you know, has become a teaching resource for them. So in these kinds of projects, you know, my mental check is to ask, am I hitting the 4 R's? does my project, whether it's research or outreach, does it reflect respect? Is it reflective of a positive, collaborative, non-exploitive relationship? Am I being responsible in the way that I'm dealing with the knowledge that's being shared to me? And am I being reciprocal? So those are hard questions to answer, especially if you're not familiar with Native American research and outreach. And so our current project is, and we did this again with an internal grant with the Office of Undergraduate Research. We're currently creating a toolkit for researchers to provide students and potential faculty affiliates with resources so that they don't cause harm. And part of this is to protect our own integrity. I mean, we have a lot of students and researchers, scholars now, that are really excited about what we're doing and they want to do research in Indian country. But if you go in there, with a savior complex or, heavily into volunteerism, you can do more harm than good. And we're also, creating this toolkit to protect the integrity of our own sponsored research. So we're trying, to do no harm. So Miigwech, if you have any questions or comments, I will get out of my presentation, and I still can't see anybody, but I do see the chat now.
There are some questions.
Okay.
And thank you. First of all, you're getting a lot of compliments and people are trying to share links. So you may want to look in there. Tim, if you can send us the chat log.
Oh, the Indigenous tour link. Yeah.
Yep. And let's see. So they are, wow, you just had so much stuff to share that's super important, and just about with the cultural and academic integrity, making sure you're using, that knowledge that you get in the right way, especially if it's recorded. I mean, some of the best teachings that I have where traditional and scholarly stuff crosses with ethic, the ethics and the things are straight away, Patty, from you.
Oh, hey, there's one comment that I think is really worth talking about, and I really appreciate it. One of the participants noted that spirituality is a value that's not on the list, and that is such an important value. But it's one that I'm Ojibwe. I'm not a member of our Midewan society, and so I'm very cautious about even talking about what I know about the Midewan. And this is a topic that Native people tend to, rightfully feel very protective of. And so it's not, if a Native community wants to do research that focuses on spirituality, and you're absolutely right, Donna, it's absolutely a value. I would be happy to work with them in approaching it in a humble way, and falling all over myself to keep asking them, how much do you want to share? What do you want to share? Because I know there's a lot of resentment in many Native communities with material that academics have shared that they feel has been very exploitive. And I hear from my own community, scholars that have written about the Midewan Lodge or the Dream Dance or Big Drum, or any number of religions. And I think this is also very true in the Southwest, especially with the Hopi and some of the Pueblo tribes, Pueblo communities. They just don't want to share this. And so I generally don't go there. It's important, but as a researcher, I'm really uncomfortable talking about spirituality to evaluators. because it's not a topic that I have a lot of competence in.
So there are two questions. I don't know if you can see them, and I figure you want to answer live rather than type. It's one of the questions is how can or how should these principles be applied in groups or settings that are not focused on Indigenous people? And I heard you say a lot of stuff, right? And one of them was, how do you take even sad stories like are painful and put a contemporary face on it and then move it forward, move that conversation forward, to use, is that a journalistic term? But and move the action
It is
forward.
now, Nikki, it is now.
Right. So how do you apply these principles you're talking about in groups or settings that are not focused on Indigenous people?
Yeah. I actually think that these principles apply to any community, really. I think they're maybe more significant for Native people because we have been in situations where a lot of the research that's been done on us has been exploitive, and we don't have political power, and we have experienced communities that, because of policies, have left us with few resources, and we're marginalized. So it's really important for us. But I think when you're working with any kind of community, respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationship are universal values, actually, that could be applied. If you're working with a small community that is dealing with flooding, for example, and you've been invited to come in and conduct research or be part of an outreach project, you want to start with finding out what values the community people have, what their vision of their future is, and incorporate that into a proposal for a grant that is co-created. The idea of, for us, again, because so much of the way we've been depicted by mainstream culture is very one-dimensionally, these poor people, Indigenous people who got swindled out of their land and are impoverished, and okay, that's true to a certain extent, but we didn't survive because of generational trauma. We survived because of creativity and innovation and resilience. And so, those qualities pull us into the future, and those are important stories to be told as well.
Another question we have, is, as an Indigenous scholar myself, do you have any specific tips for working with tribes other than your own?
Yeah, I've been really, I've been fortunate to work with a number of tribes other than the Ojibwe, and those listening and relationship building is where you start. I've been working with the Quinault Nation in Washington for a couple of years, and I took a group of journalists, graduate journalists, out there, and the relationship that we built was really, I think, a really healthy one. And what I told my students was to, when you go into a community and you say, these are my skills, I'm interested in this topic, I'm really interested in climate change, and I'm fascinated by your community moving to higher ground because of, the Quinault have oral history that tells them that every 300 some years they get a doozy of an earthquake followed by a tsunami. Well, their K-12 school, their senior center, their Head Start are all located in the tsunami zone. So they are actively moving to higher ground, and they're doing some really interesting things. The Anderson Glacier totally melted in 2015, and it's wreaked havoc on the Quinault River, and the salmon runs that used to be so plentiful are now depleted because the water is rushing. They're getting worse storms, and the river is moving too fast, and the salmon can't lay. They lay their eggs, but they don't have an opportunity to adhere to the gravel, and the eggs hatch. They just get washed out into the ocean. So when my students were researching the community, one of them was really interested in salmon and was really interested in climate change and the loss of the glacier. And I said, don't go in with a preconceived idea. Talk to people and say, I'm really interested in fisheries, and I'm really interested in the impact of the loss of your glacier. What kind of story would you like to see? What stories haven't been told? What stories should I concentrate on? And because she asked, they said, well, one of the things we're doing is we're taking giant cranes and we're dropping entire trees in the river to create side channels and slow the river down. Great story, hadn't been told, really interesting. Those are the kinds of things that those exchanges, that relationship building leads to really productive research and outreach opportunities. So I don't think you necessarily need to be a member of a particular tribe in order to work with that tribe. I think there are universal protocols, and I think respect, again, I keep coming back to those 4 R's, respect, relationship, responsibility, and reciprocity will do you a lot of good.
There are a few comments, Patty, in the chat area you might want to look at and respond to, or just take a moment to reflect on. I know we're getting close. We have about a minute left.
Appreciate the narrative around humility. Approaching the spot. Thank you. Okay. In earlier session, questions from Mr. for how to effectively contribute culturally responsive evaluation as an outsider. Okay, yeah, you can't ever understand another culture. Thank you. How different our evaluations would be if we did look back 3 generations, considered the present moment, and considered the next 3. Yeah. Am I missing something? I mean, there's a lot here, and should I start at the beginning?
No, you don't.
And, what I just love is people talking about where they're from, all the land acknowledgements. Isn't that beautiful? Oh yeah. Oh, Kiara, yes. Aloha. Oh, this is just beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm interested. 7 generations into the future is similar to the concept of Sankofa from African cultures. I'm not familiar with that, but I'm writing that down, and I'm gonna look that up after that. See, that's the one thing. Every time I think I'm teaching, I wind up, realizing, oh, I'm learning too.
There's another question that just came in. How can we in the culturally responsive community have your back in your fight for Indigenous data sovereignty?
Oh, yeah. Well, that it's not an easy, there are no easy answers, because at some point there has to be trust, because You can partner with a university or a library, and you can create. One of the things that the group that I'm working with here at Northwestern is trying to do is to create, and I'm not a computer engineer, but the way they described it, it's like this set of interlocking keys, and the last little house where the sacred knowledge would be could be opened only by the tribal historic preservation officer or whomever the community designated to protect that knowledge. But at some point, you know, we're dependent on the people that own the pipes, the internet providers, at some point we have to trust. And I think, I don't know the answer. I've gone over and over and over, but there's a wonderful program called Mukatu, which was developed in Australia. And the Washington State University people have been gracious and selfless in sharing that knowledge with the enthusiasm of the community in Australia that developed it. But it's really difficult. You have to, it's difficult because there's not enough bandwidth in order to upload much video. And, we're communities that deal in the oral tradition. So video is, often part of what's collected. And so where does that video live? Does it live on a private setting in YouTube? Oh, I'm not really comfortable with that. Or Vimeo, these file sharing sites where this kind of video might live are way too unprotected. So does it live on a hard drive in a tribal library? Well, that means you have to physically go there. And we're living in this age where information is shared. And what happens if there's a fire? We all know what happens to records and media, if there's a fire somewhere. So those kinds of questions still need to be worked out. And I don't have a good answer for that. I think the first step is awareness that this is a problem.
And specific to your Mukatu, and maybe this is for later since we're over time here, Monique Tindall, her mom is a Bowman, yes, family is that Menominee tribe, and she's setting up Mukatu according to the Mukadu, or however you say it, according to the 5 principal Menominee clans and tagging by subclans. So it's brand new. Those Bowmans like to make their own little frameworks and stuff. So that's one way. And I know that Menominee Nation is holding that data within their Menominee Language Culture Commission, which is very strong, that has language and IRB ordinances and things like that. So more on this, but this is what a great subject and what a great question. I'm sorry we have to, I know there's going to be, I think there's going to be maybe an evaluation that comes out. Tim will let us know if I'm wrong, but I just, it's not Native way to stop when the time says stop. We sort of go and we could go, but we want to be respectful. We know, depending on where you are, you might want to get up and stretch. You might be having supper or sunset ceremony, whatever it is. But I just want to thank you, Patty, again. Everything you talk about is awesome. Make her next time tell the story of her airport ride to Madison and almost making I don't know what he was. She's a STEMinist. Indigenous STEMinist is what Patty is, and she made some big time dude late almost for the plane. She was arguing with the keynote of the graduation keynote. Didn't he win a Pulitzer Prize or a Nobel Peace Prize for science? And Patty's arguing Anishinaabe knowledge with him.
With Neil deGrasse. Story. With Neil deGrasse Tyson, yeah.
Oh yeah. So there you go. That's how matrilineal quiz roll, people. I call it Resdashian, but that's for another time too. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank CREA for bringing in, I love seeing the voice and visibility of our Native scholars who are also traditional and aunties to a lot of us. We're ending the session, giving thanks to CREA for all of you being here virtually. I can't wait till we're together and we can act crazy in Chicago. And then please tomorrow sign in. I think our keynote, our first one, our plenary starts at 8:30, but we Kike Milosis, that would be elder leader Edmund Gordon is going to be being celebrated at lunchtime. So we'll give a shout out to him in a good way. And then I think that's about it. We'll wrap up unless Stafford or Timothy have anything else to add, or Patty.
Bama P. Hope to see you again. Thank you so much.